I'll just sort of, I'll have a sip, and then if I need to...
Exactly. Have a seat. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. We've still got one or two people coming in at the back, but I think we will make a start. Good evening and welcome to the Conduit Club and to this On Frontline event. My name is Chris Morris. I am currently the CEO of Full Fact, which is the UK's independent fact-checking charity. We kind of fight against bad information and try to hold politicians to account for what they say, so quite busy in the day. Before that, for a long time, I was a foreign correspondent with the BBC, and Pierre and I have been discussing, covering many of the conflicts which he discusses in his forthcoming book. And it just occurred to me, actually, preparing for this event, that we spend a lot of time these events here at the Conduit Club, conflicts about the human political costs, about the strategy, about the consequences, but we spend less time, perhaps, on the most difficult bit of all, which is how do you bring the conflict to an end, and how do you make those hard choices? The question you were asked to discuss, you know, the balance between peace and justice, and how do you negotiate between people who sometimes are very, very unequal? And these are some of the issues that we are going to discuss this evening, and I think we've got two people with me on stage who are impressively well qualified to do so. First of all, let me introduce to me Pierre Hazan. He's with the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue. He's a former fellow of Harvard Law School and also, some time ago now, a former diplomatic correspondent with Libération, and has spent many years behind the scenes on conflict resolution and on mediation, working with government NGOs. And he's now written, they've already bought a copy of it at the back of the room. It's not actually published until the 1st of February, so this is exclusive access. It's called Negotiating with the Devil, Inside the World of Armed Conflict Mediation. And it's about what Pierre has experienced over many years. Claire Hajaj, who's currently Deputy CEO at Intermediate, which works to end conflicts worldwide. She's worked in conflict resolution in many places. I have a list here: Lebanon, Kosovo, Iraq, Myanmar, Nigeria, Pakistan, and some of the work, not all of it certainly, but some of it has been with the United. Also, very impressively, the author of 2 novels, so we will all read those as well. Obviously, 2 conflicts are very much on people's minds at the moment: Ukraine and the war in the Middle East in Gaza. We were just talking beforehand, though, there are many other wars in the world which get virtually no publicity, Tigray, for example, and many others. So though those are the 2 conflicts that are in which need urgent resolution. So what I'm going to do is spend a few minutes, obviously, with the 2 of our panelists on stage, ask them both to make introductory remarks, and then I'll ask them a few questions, and then, of course, we will open things up to questions from the floor. So, Pierre, perhaps I could start with you. Negotiating with the Devil, it's perhaps a deliberately provocative title, and it comes from a rich experience. What was it that made you want to write this book?
Good evening, Chris, and good evening to everyone. It's great to be here. I guess being in the field and being confronted to very, very difficult situations, I was, for many years, I was trying to think what was the best solution, which, when I was well, let me rephrase it. confronted to very difficult situations, very hard choices, very difficult dilemmas. And you wonder, what is the lesser evil? And sometimes you're not sure. And before it has been mentioned, the peace versus justice dilemma, but there are others. What do you sacrifice in the name of peace? What is the price of peace? Sometimes it's women's rights. Sometimes it's guarantee for minorities. We're discussing with you about the Dayton peace, which put an end to the awful war in former Yugoslavia. But at the same time, it's a very imperfect peace. It's a frozen war, basically, than a peace. So what is the right choice? What is the responsibility of every stakeholder? So that was maybe one of the first reasons I wanted to think about how to deal with difficult situations. And I couldn't find anything actually in the literature. So I said, maybe I need to think about it and maybe possibly to write. And then another thing happened to me is, we are all living in a very international tense situation. The world has changed dramatically in the last 10, 15 years. So there is a new map. China has risen, Russia is pretty aggressive, Europe is pretty divided, and so on and on. But also the map of mediation has dramatically changed. It's no more Switzerland and Norway like it used to be. It's other players, Turkey, who have ever imagined that Saudi Arabia or the Emirates will make a deal between Russia and Ukraine to exchange some prisoners. When you think about the last deal which happened between Hamas and Israel regarding the release of hostages in exchange for one additional day of ceasefire, I mean, it's a very partial deal, very fragile, very, I mean, it tells the state of a very difficult, actually. And then, which brings me to my last point, which is the responsibility of mediators to have some kind of moral compass. I think otherwise, consequences comes of lives. So I think for all these reasons, I guess I wanted to think about it and to write a few lines.
It's interesting you say responsibility. There's one sentence in the book which struck out to me. You talked about the ethics of conviction, which guided you as a journalist, and the ethics of responsibility, which you tried to address in the world of media. I mean, we were both journalists for a long time, and it's righteous isn't quite the right word, but it's quite easy to take a stand. But it's the mediators work in the grey area where it's more difficult to do that. Well,
I think for me, my first experience was pretty. As a journalist, it's easy to criticize everyone, to be to have a moral high ground, and suddenly, when you are almost confronted to a kind of sophist choices to decide who is going to live and who is going to die, then gray areas. And for me, it was very shocking, actually. And for years and years, I was trying to think what was the right decision, not the right decisions, the way do we handle it, or so you keep thinking about it. So that's why also I wanted to produce. I mean,
Claire, welcome, and I believe you've read Pierre's book, and obviously your reflection on the book and from the experience you bring of many years of working in mediation.
Well, I mean, I want to thank Pierre for writing the book, and I've said to him already, it was an incredibly uncomfortable read for a mediator. Read because we all, as mediators, have a devil's bargain in our past somewhere. And, you know, nobody wants to make a devil's bargain. No government wants to negotiate with the devil. No mediator wants to negotiate and make a difficult, complex agreement. Controversial. But, you know, when you look around at the world today, and one of the things that your book really outlines is that it feels like there are more devils than there used to be. I mean, we've spent the last 20 years designating devils across the Sahel, across the Middle East, in states that we like of people. I mean, we're actually thinking about designating the Houthis. That's going to be the next people who were designated devils. And there are millions of people living in these conflict zones where devils have been designated. And some of the worst devils are actually not designated, but they're still very much there. And we as mediators are sometimes accused, and we spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of time, making the case for negotiations with these devils. And you can be very quickly accused of being the peace at any price people. And one of the things that occurred to me when I was reading your book and thinking about, and it's relevant to the big conflict that's on everybody's mind now, is that sometimes when you choose not to negotiate, you don't want to pay the price. You actually pass that price on to someone else in the future. So to me, the great example of this was Afghanistan. We didn't want to make a devil's bargain with the Taliban when they came to us in 2004. We believed that we had achieved a comprehensive military victory and that we had effectively eradicated, sort of blown away by our own success. We didn't want to pay the price politically. We didn't want to pay the price morally. 1921, August, I was sitting there watching us hand effectively the country back to the Taliban. It was the people of the country that paid that price eventually. And it was really very emblematic. That scene of chaos at the airport, I know that everybody here probably will never forget it. I certainly will never forget it. We worked on the Afghan peace process for 3 years. It was one of the bitterest and saddest moments of my life, watching that happen. It was emblematic, not just the failure of the collapse of a long era of assumptions that we in the West could impose a peace that we find acceptable at a price we found easy to pay, and that we could do it through hard power, we could do it through shared values where everybody basically feels the same about how you resolve conflicts, and that you could do it through Security Council resolution. True, I think, for you to say, we all know instinctively the cost of war. We know what it costs. What's harder to accept is that peace also has a price, and really the question is, how high is too high? Who decides who pays at the end of the day? How do we make that choice? Anybody who will tell you, I think as a mediator working on all of the conflicts we know and others that are less famous, from Venezuela to North Korea to South Thailand, where people are regularly dying at a tremendous rate. Nobody knows what the answer is in this much, much messier world that we have. But to me, that there are 4 things that your book made me think about. And I think that they're just maybe guidance for mediation in this much more complicated world. One is not to negotiate sometimes. And your book outlines cases where that is absolutely the right choice. Ukraine is an example in the very early stages of the war when they ended up negotiating on an agenda that was a purely Russian agenda, and they made an agreement they had to very quickly back away from the end. But there are cases where it's not right. But the second, never be an emotional or an ideological decision. You have to have an alternative to negotiations if you're going to reject it. Groups that have political support, as much as they may be human rights violators, cannot just be eradicated, and we see that. The Taliban, we've seen it with ISIS in Mosul, who now are just all over the place, and it's a lesson that we refuse to learn. The third thing to say is that we shouldn't make it harder for ourselves and push up the price of peace. All of this designation, all of our devils, they just make it harder, and you make that point very well. We tie. At the end of the day, where they have support, it's already hard enough. I think in 1919, David Lloyd George said, about the IRA, we will never talk to that murder gang. It took another 80 years for them to conclude the Good Friday Agreement that finally put an end to the conflict. And there were many lives lost in the interim. Climb up a hill. We've seen it with the Taliban. We saw it with, Zelensky said he's never going to negotiate on Ukraine. That there may be a point at which, when you've marched your population up a hill, marching them then back down becomes much, much harder. And the final thing that your book made me think about, and this is the answer to peace and justice, you can say we can have a peace without justice. And nobody wants to accept that. I certainly don't as a mediator at all. But I think the measure of a peace is not who you negotiate it with, but what it delivers for people, ultimately, and if it delivers something fundamental, not just borders boundaries, but just as the GFA, the Good Friday Catholic identity for Catholics, and Irish identity for Catholics in Northern Ireland. So what it delivers for people rather than who it's negotiated with is a measure. But none of these are simple things. And I entered your book feeling much more disturbed than when I started.
Well, thanks for that, Claire. You talk about the long climb up the hill. And obviously, a lot of it is about the destination, what happens, where do you arrive at the end of a mediation. But I'm interested in the beginning of a mediation, a question that Pierre poses in his book, and maybe you could both reflect on this, is to what extent should you remain neutral between an aggressor and the aggressed? And I guess that's partly a question of perception, because who is the aggressor depends on where you're looking at it from. But to what extent can you set aside examples of aggression when you begin?
Well, for me, the concept of neutrality is, I don't use it because I think it's morally impossible to assume it. You are confronted with situations where you have people who are violating human rights in such a flagrant way. It's very, I mean, you cannot. The question then is become about impartiality. And impartiality, then how do you define it? To be at equal distance between two camps. It's more about trying to give the tools necessary to each side to reach some kind of agreement. And I think that's a more interesting and stimulating approach. So it's looking forward and trying to be effective, but it's not about neutrality.
I agree with that. I mean, there are all kinds of new phrases that are coming up now. People don't talk about impartiality, but multi-partiality and other things. But from a human perspective, I mean, I grew up in the... I spent time in Saudi Arabia, and I have a very strong, visceral, instinctive reaction as a human to people who violate women's rights and don't allow women in the public space. And I have yet found myself at negotiation tables trying to convince the hardest line radicals to come into a dialogue process, and that is very, very hard. You cannot be, as a human, neutral in those circumstances. But I think the job of mediation, and the difficult job of mediation, is I've heard it described as like the golden escalator, is to get people onto a path and climb out of whatever place they have got themselves stuck in. And that is, and it's not without you, it's not about then what your opinion is of this individual, what you're trying to create, or the group, or what they stand for, their ideology. Trying to find a way to limit the worst of the damage that is caused by the worst of the clashes between what they think is right and just and the people that they are fighting with. And it is a very, very hard thing to do, but there are not many people who are willing to do it. And those who don't, when you don't do it, the people who pay the price are the people who are stuck in these conflict zones and without any kind of recourse.
One era you're very critical of was post 9/11, the war on terror in the book, and the idea that you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. I guess shut down the grey area where the mediators need to operate. Are we still in that same era, or have we moved on beyond that?
You want to go first?
Just to say, it was the 20th anniversary of 9/11 a couple of years ago. And if you look around at what we have achieved of the war on terror, I mean, an expensive stalemate would be kind to say. We have achieved some things, but effectively, you know, recruitment is still happening all over the place. ISIS is spreading through the Sahel. This is now, it's overlapping with all of the sort of environmental and governance concerns that you have in sub-Saharan Africa. We are not winning this war. And nowhere else would we tell ourselves for 20 years that we can bomb and buy our way out of these conflicts and keep telling ourselves the same thing in the face of the evidence. So when you're saying that these are good guys, but we have created an architecture that actually criminalizes any attempt to find a different way to solve these problems. And that, to me, is a recipe for being in the same place in another 20 years.
I totally agree with what you say, obviously. And what is really ironic is the situation is so absurd that states they want a military solution. They are totally unable to achieve it. They want to talk to the people to talk to, because they decide they are not going to talk to these people, but they still need to talk to. So they are trying to find some kind of solution, and the solution is clear, or other people like organizations like you are working for, which are basically being paid by states to talk to, which are being labeled as terrorists. So you see, the way the 9/11, the resolution 1373 at the Security Council was such a tool which prevented actually to create more dialogue, more mediation, more stability. And the fantasy that military solution is going to happen, well, we have seen, it's exactly what Claire was saying. Military solutions failed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in so many places. That's why mediation is a tool, but it's not, it's just a tool. It's no more thick also. And it's happening in a very different moment than 10 or 20 years ago. 20 years ago, there was Pax Americana. Now it's no more Pax Americana. We are in different era. It's we are living in a multipolar world, which is becoming extremely dangerous. It can happen, not like, Colombia deals, Colombia peace deal will be some kind of haven today between a government, sorry, I don't want to depress even more, but I think there will be partial mediations on things. For me, something very interesting is, and my organization tried to, helped also, was a grain deal between Russia and Ukraine in order to prevent a starvation in some parts of Africa. So both sides were basically agreeing to killing each other, but exporting their grain. And I think it's, rationally, it's interesting, and psychologically as well. By the way, my wife is a shrink. And another example, which I think it's also interesting, is what I was saying earlier about Gaza. That Israel wants to eradicate Hamas. Hamas wants to destroy Israel, but they can still agree to exchange hostages against ceasefire. So we are entering in this era, which is very dangerous, very tense, and where the deals will be very fragile.
You mentioned the fact that military solutions have failed in many places in the last 20 years. Sometimes mediation fails, right? Not for want of trying, but sometimes it does. We were talking earlier, I spent several years in Sri Lanka, and we all know that the Norwegians spent years and years and huge amounts of time and resources. And was it just a case that both sides were just playing them while they tried to build up their own strength? But that was a conflict which ended in terrible bloodshed. What are the reflections when a mediation fails?
Well, I think one of the very tough questions, there are a number of hard choices, very difficult dilemmas. That's one of them. When both sides pretend to be engaged in a peace process and they are not, when do you say enough is enough? And it's a very hard call. If you take some examples, if you take, the Basque country, there have been so many attempts of negotiations, and then there was a bombing and everything stopped. And then it had to be continued. So it's a very difficult choice for mediators to say. And in that case, yes, I guess the Sri Lankan government was playing the mediator, yes.
Yeah. You said that sometimes mediation fails. It often fails. And I think, maybe like cancer treatment, sometimes it fails, and maybe frequently it fails. And the Colombia peace agreement that you mentioned, there were several failed attempts to reach that agreement. And there was one agreement in Caguan, one negotiation session where they turned up with an agenda that was 100 items long, including the, sort of the end of capitalism was at the bottom. So pretty much, in even the Good Friday Agreement, Seamus Mallon called it Sunningdale for slow learners. In 1975, there was an identical, pretty much, agreement that didn't stick. Didn't have the IRA in it. No, that was the difference. So every successful peace agreement is built on the bones of agreements and mediations that have failed. And that's why we are such suckers. I think the job of a mediator is to persistently test the possibilities, because there has never been a case of a conflict just ending painlessly by itself. Either it ends bloodily, or it ends through mediation. So I think it fails frequently, and then sometimes it succeeds later.
Can I ask you, both of you spend a lot of time dealing with other people, but to look inwards a bit, what makes a good mediator?
I think what is there are 50 shades of mediators. According to the situations. So I think mediators need to be adapted to the situation. So one mediator could be very good in one situation and terrible in another one.
So you have to play good cop, bad cop sometimes?
Maybe, but also it depends on, I mean, some people, they function very well in certain countries and not very well because they don't get it. Then we haven't yet mentioned local mediators, who are very important and very often they play international mediators because they know the language, they are able to decipher what's happening, they understand the social dynamics. So, and they are taking huge risks. I think, well, I have some friends who actually, from our organization, who died because they were working locally. And sometimes they are being perceived as traitors by one side and as spies. And so it could be very dangerous for local mediators. And I think for me, they are not often,
Yeah, that I definitely agree with. And I think, I mean, I've got colleagues here who work with us on mediation at different levels. And the day of the big celebrity mediator, and that used to be that we had these, big celebrity mediators in the UN, and they would fly around the world with mediation briefcases before breakfast. And
I'm thinking Richard Holbrooke.
Naming no names. So those days are gone because the institutions that supported that kind of certainty have really gone. And now mediation is a much messier business, and at times people want the hard power leverage in the room, and sometimes they just want a facilitator, and sometimes they want somebody who really understands the nuances of their particular issue. I think, so I mean, there is a sort of a theory of how negotiation works that I've found in practice people really want is someone who will stick with them through the difficult process of failing and trying again and failing and trying again, and be capable of providing advice that is politically realistic. But the thing that we also haven't talked about a little, and this is where I'm thinking about my other colleagues, is the role that the people of the conflict actually play in creating a context where mediation can work. You write about the post-truth world, but there's a flip side to the post-truth world, which is people who can much bigger, faster ways of bringing populations together to express their opinions and their views. That's still very underutilized. And I think as we go ahead into the next 20 years of trying to end conflicts, the role that local people play in deciding what is right for them and what justice means for them is going to be much bigger, because their voices are going to be much space, and that is a good thing.
It's interesting when you say it's a messier business. I mean, is that partly because we're no longer a unipolar world? I mean, Pierre mentioned the Bosnian peace process, where basically the United States forced leaders Yeah, you're not
Stop
leaving.
bombing.
You're not leaving data in Ohio until on this piece of paper.
It's become shorthand. Now people talk about we're going to do a Dayton lockdown on you. I mean, literally,
Is that right?
that's people say that in when thinking about how do we make a mediation. What do we need to sit with them quietly here, or do we Dayton them? Do we take them somewhere and lock them away? The big institutions that were set up to do this work have, in the last 20 years, been absolutely brutalized by events. The UN has been destroyed by Syria, particularly, and then by Ukraine. The Security Council is gridlocked. The US, as you said, has lost a lot of its moral authority, as have the West. It's just those sort of big guiding lights and the institutional frameworks and the values that we were so comfortable with, that architecture has been shaken by many earthquakes. And so, as a result of that, it is a multi-world. That doesn't mean it's for sure, but maybe it was something that needed to happen.
Well, I think with Pax Americana, we had norms. I mean, sometimes we were twisted by the West, but still we had norms. Today, it's more difficult. I mean, the rules of the games have changed, and we are not really sure what they are, because the world is in flux, and because of that creates uncertainty. What's happening with the defense budgets? Everywhere it's rising brutally. So everyone is ready, basically, is getting prepared for wars. So well, then, yeah, that's a new reality. I mean, basically, the last 2 years, and people who died in combat, it's a big number. Climate change is a conflict accelerator as well. So when you add all the different factors, the situation is pretty grim, I would say.
Questions from the floor in a second, so please have some ready. Just one last question. You mentioned the UN and Syria, and I wanted to ask you, how does the UN start to rebuild from, as you said, the disaster or the ruins that were created for it in Syria? How does it rebuild credibility, capacity, and the mediator?
Well, there is a say. Big countries, they want the UN to be just, the Secretary General just to be a secretary. And small countries, they want the UN to be a general. And actually, the Security Council decides. So even a general, I'm afraid. In order to be effective, you need some kind of cohesion inside the Security Council. We don't have it. We have a Security Council very divided. So obviously, the Secretary General will be extremely weak. And it's true that everyone can remember Guterres going to Moscow, talking to Putin, then going to Kiev the next day and receiving 2 missiles from Russia. The signal couldn't have been more clear about how not credible the UN has become. Regarding Syria, we are talking about dilemmas. That was really hard, tough choices. A lot of the UN, but also other organizations had to decide if it was better to participate in some kind of deportation of population of their lives, or not to do anything, but not to be accused one day to be accomplices of war crimes. So you see, that was a real difficult dilemma at the time, which also for old people they will remember what happened in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was
that was the devil's bargain that I was the most ashamed of at the time. As I was living in Lebanon and during the Syria crisis and working with the UN, we were trying to, the UN was trying to broker a besieged town called Madaya. Eventually persuaded the Syrian government to allow them to do that in a very, very difficult and complicated mediation that involved Hezbollah and a number of other forces. But what the Syrian government allowed them to deliver in the end was anti-malarial bed nets and a bunch of other health supplies. And I remember the sort of acute, horrible, sick sense of shame when those trucks were opened and people saw what they hadn't got and they were starving. You know, the UN tries to be like a parent in a way, all things. And sometimes it's just impossible. You can't be a forum for international consensus and the upholder of international human rights norms and a humanitarian aid provider of last resort. You cannot be all of those things. The UN needs to decide what it wants to be.
It's exactly what happened in Srebrenica, and that's why also this security zone, which was supposed to protect, was not effective.
And I guess it's only as powerful or as strong as the leading countries within it allow it to be as well. Questions from the floor. We've got a couple of microphones. Have we got one at the back? Yes, we have. So I'll do the ones at the front. So do you want to do one right at the back there, and then, so we'll do this one. Yes, sir, and then.
Great. Hi, it's Paul, and hi, Pierre. Paul from the Conduit. Hello. So I wanted to ask a question about the things that are in mediators' toolboxes in a new multipolar, non-Pax Americana world, because in the times that we were doing this, we always sat with international law tucked into our back pocket and said it imposes a set of obligations on states to prosecute and punish and try and achieve justice. And even though to get it, because of the balance of forces at the time of the mediation, you had that little card in your pocket that you played in order to maximize a just outcome. So international law is eroding. Bad actors are more powerful than they were. But if you're wanting to be an optimist, do you have in your toolbox that you can deploy to try and maximize both durable pieces and just outcomes in this new, messier, less Pax Americana world?
I want to take one more question, and then you can answer both together. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Actually, I have two unrelated questions. You mentioned a change in the mediation landscape with other new actors taking over. Do you think that the method will also change how you approach a mediation? Traditionally, it was very Western, Norway, and the usual. With new actors, do you think new method will emerge? And my second question is, I know HD has been doing quite a lot in this, but do you see the role of women at the local level? What is the role that women can play in peace processes?
So, I don't know who wants to go first. What else in the toolbox, and the questions from the front?
So, okay, good questions. What's in the new toolbox? I mean, I guess for a slightly new age, that you probably have, like anybody's toolbox, some things that are updated and some fundamentally. International law is still international law. It still exists. There are still those norms, and I don't think any of us want to just to take them and say, well, you know, this was yesterday's news, and so we don't really care about the Geneva Conventions and International Criminal Court. Those are actually still very imperative sometimes for parties to come to the table or avoid taking certain actions. But I think what we try and do now in this much messier world, and it is very, very hard, is first of all, we found that some of the conflict parties, they don't want me. What they want is somebody to help them build a coalition that makes it safe for them to take the steps that they want to take, where there is something in it for everyone. And 90% of the work the thinking work that we do is sitting down and trying to think, what coalition could you build where everybody sees something in it for them to come out of this appalling situation and find a way to silence the guns. And do it in such a way that you are not fundamentally violating, that it's the good enough piece. And that's a hard call to make, what the good enough, and the measure is, does it deliver something fundamental? Is it just a tactical thing about borders and boundaries? And this goes to the question that somebody who was asking about how things have changed. new parties that are coming and actually doing an awful lot of brokering for an awful lot of the powers that used to be doing the brokering, they take a much more business-like approach to things, I've found. They take a much more business-like approach. But they are also still fundamentally open to the ideas sometimes of a future in which they carry a moral flag as well. It's for all of us, but what they don't want to do is be under the Western flag and do things in the Western way. So part of the job, again, is saying, in this new landscape, how do we create a set of values that we can all stand behind, that still serve people in conflict zones rather than just serve the interests of great powers?
I guess hi Paul, it's good to see you after so many years. I guess one of interesting phenomenon for me is in many areas, the local leaders are pretty powerful, but they need to their own constituency, to their own society. And so one of the interesting factor is to be able to listen to the population, to listen to their needs, and to try to make the leaders also understand that to a certain extent try to accommodate the needs of a society with its own personal interest. That's something I find it interesting. I'm thinking about very concretely about the situation in Niger, in the region where Boko Haram is, and there were a lot of different conflicts, and it will be too complicated to explain, but basically what we were able to do is we interviewed 800 people, and we understood that actually the population wanted a number of things which could be made possible with the willingness of a number of actors. So it's also new strategies, I guess, and the fact that accessing more, maybe I will rephrase, a lot of deals in the past have been done by the elite. And you basically, after 5 or 10 years, 50% of the peace agreements fail. And one of the reasons is because it was elite deals. So there is but it's important to reach the people in order to create sustainable conditions to be effective. And I think that's one factor. About the gender dimension, yes, it's becoming more and more a factor, especially because at the local level, women are very influential. In societies, they play a key role, but not only the women, I would say, who are usually marginalized, but also youth. If, again, I take the same example of Niger, the average age is 15 years old. In Europe, it's more than 40 years old. So if you don't include the women, you don't understand anything about the society. So you need basically also to be able to have a clear understanding of the dynamic of a society and to be inclusive enough to create an effective system of mediation.
And it's the youth who are doing the fight. Youth who are doing the fighting.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all the kids.
And something also, sorry to interrupt, but I think also a new era, which is very problematic, and I'm not sure we don't have any answer to that, is the war is also hybrid war. And the question is, how do you create a net? But there are already some thinking about how to deal with hate speech on social networks. There have been code of conducts which have been established in central Nigeria and in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So there are a few things starting to emerge, but artificial working on deepfakes and other questions like that are very important. So how do you deal with vectors of violence and how you can transform it in terms of mediation and negotiation?
And just coming back on the, I guess I can call them the facilitatory measures you're talking about, how do you apply this to a conflict like the one between Israel and Hamas, where both sides are sworn to destroy each other?
So, I mean, yeah, I've managed to almost not say anything about Israel Hamas since the war started, because it's just an impossible one, albeit we're like involved in some way. So I think, generally speaking, it's a matter of principle that parties, I mean, and we say this, that parties' positions and their interests are, their public positions and their private interests are not always the same. So in the immediate aftermath of an appalling trauma, and trauma has been suffered by the Israeli people and Palestinian people. Traumas on a different scale, but to each of those people, those traumas are felt very, very deeply. Hamas says that it's sworn to destroy Israel. Israel says that it's sworn to eradicate Hamas. Both, if you know, quietly in a private space, they know that these are objectives that are going to be extremely hard to achieve. But what is the incentive to let go of an objective unless there is an alternative path? And that is the challenge of mediation. So public positions are ways of setting out, if you like, a stall. What is behind the stall, that can be very different. So how do you approach something like this? I mean, we know with Israel, Gaza, I mean, we know that there's a huge effort at the moment, and it's like the preeminent international effort to try a way out. For us, I think, as mediation organizations, we would probably all take much the same position that says that ultimately conflicts always restart unless the power holders and the populations are involved in agreement that deliver both sides. What is fundamental to the Palestinian movement is a political horizon, something that restores dignity, identity, and the things that have been missing so far from any of the peace processes that we've been involved in since Oslo. And that's a whole different discussion. And what is important to the Israelis is that 7th of October never happens again, and that their also identity and sense of security is preserved. Is there a path towards that? Theoretically, yes. Politically, that's a different thing.
Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, there are so many stakeholders in this conflict. Obviously, you have Hamas and the Israeli government. You have a number of other players. What is interesting is not only you have this conflict, but this conflict is also linked with what's happening regionally, and we see and the Hezbollah and what's happening actually in Iraq today. So, and South Lebanon also. So you have a first layer, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Then you need also to include somehow a regional layer, and then an international layer, because all are linked, basically. Obviously, you need some kind of for ceasefire. You need also some kind of vision in terms of which will be the new Palestinian, and obviously a roadmap, but that's, as Claire mentioned, extremely difficult to build. You need also to find some kind of agreement, and we know that the last few days there have been a lot of discussions about deals between releasing the hostages against 1 or 2 months of the Egyptian plan, which was also quite interesting, offering not only this dimension and with almost a timetable for different types of hostages, but also creating an interim technocratic Palestinian and in the West Bank. There are some other ideas which are circulating, for instance, creating a kind of trusteeship which existed in Kosovo for a while. Yeah. So there are a lot of formulas. We've seen that there have been discussions between the Saudis and the American construction of Gaza, and on the recognition of the State of Israel by Arab states, and so on and on. So there are a lot of discussions, a lot of traveling of many people, but we are still far from the solution. And I guess there are a number of hurdles, and we know some of them, obviously, the prime minister of a certain country.
Yeah.
But it's not the only one.
Just to say very, very quickly on this before we move off Gaza, just say, I am half Jewish, half Palestinian. My parents on both sides of this conflict. We've had, until before 7th of October, the story of this conflict was basically the failure of the Oslo Accords. We were in a complete stasis where we were repeating the same, failed policies again and again and again. Nobody would wish the trauma of 7th of October and what has come after on any peoples. It has been a huge trauma to my family on both sides, to people, and the loss of life is utterly catastrophic. What, though, you can say now is that a dynamic that was very, very frozen is now open in a different way. And people who were previously not looking for solutions, and I would include the Saudis among them, are now very anxiously looking. What is also abundantly clear is, despite the Houthis having their moment in the sun, is that actually nobody really wants a regional war. And that doesn't mean you won't get into one, because a lot of wars happen without people wanting to have them. But that there is a huge anxiety to find a path through among actors in the region who before were not interested. So if there is a reason for thinking and hoping that there could be some change, that is certainly one.
Okay, let's go to, there's a question here. Is there the microphone at the back? There's two questions at the back, and then we will come back to, yeah.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Just building on what you said, there's many plans in the offing. Obviously, there was an Arab Peace Initiative at one point, supposedly written by the Saudis and helped by Americans or whatever. I'm not saying that's the plan, but what I'm interested in, you talked a little bit about outside actors and then of course the importance of local and regional actors. Do you think that this can be done regionally? Because someone also said you should ignore everything that regional players are saying in English because it's irrelevant. Listen to what they're saying in their own languages. Do you think that, given how tense everything is and the fact that they want a way forward, but also given all of their own interests, that a solution can be found through a regional mediator? Or is that just going to be too difficult and complex? I'm just interested in your opinion on that, because it's one that I'm thinking about. Thanks.
We'll just get a couple more questions, so we'll take them in a group. So yeah.
Yeah, hi. I've worked on the Sahel for the last number of years. Great to hear Niger mentioned. But my impression is, as we think about different models that are working, that particularly across the Sahel, there's been some real opportunities with regional, where the region has appointed or found regional envoys, special envoys. They may still are part of the elite. There's real potential in terms of their understanding and their ability to build bridges, and yet incredibly poorly resourced. And I sort of have wondered, is there ways that the West or other interested actors could be resourcing better and getting behind those missions in order to advance of progress? I wonder whether you had any thoughts on that, or whether you've seen it elsewhere.
And there's one other question on there in the back row.
Hopefully 3 isn't too many. First of all, I want to say thank you for illustrating that, the incredible complexity of the ecosystem you're dealing in, all the various stakeholders and all the various constituents around to try and mediate around these conflicts. I particularly wanted to ask about, kind of coming off the question about international law, about the role of the ICJ and the ICC in all of this, because obviously we have the context of the International Criminal Tribunal of the Yugoslavia and the convictions that resulted from that, but we also certainly the case being brought by South Africa against Israel and the indictment of Putin in the ICC. And I wanted to ask you whether those are complicating factors while they are happening in the course of a conflict, because I think Claire mentioned about the importance of bringing people to the table. And at the same time, I was also thinking not the need, but the concern about certain actors not having off-ramps. What is I'm not necessarily one way or the other on this, but I would just like your view on where these institutions of international justice fit when they are mediating on these conflicts while they are actually happening before the peace agreement.
Okay, shall we start with the idea of regional mediation in the Middle East?
Vic, you can take all the Gaza ones.
I guess what happened already in the past and what's happening today discreetly, more a kind of co-mediation between Qatar, Egypt, the US, And I think it will be more what I imagine, I don't know, but my feeling is that type of model will be replicated.
I don't think this can be solved by regional mediation alone, but the region has to play its role, and there is a slightly new regional context. I mean, we don't want to overstate the excitement of the Iran-Saudi deal, but there is a new desire to engage on this. Without the region, what's going to be challenging is that you have regional players who don't work together particularly well, and yet each have their own particular sponsee, if you like, in this conflict. So one of the tricks and one of the challenges is going to be, how do you get the region to work together effectively so that all the people who need to be at the table are at the table, and that's going to be tricky.
Okay, then in a much more underreported region, the Sahel, what are the prospects of getting countries that have the resource to create the conditions where regional mediation can flourish?
I worked for many years in the Sahel region, and it's a very difficult situation today because we had regime which were coming from basically the colonial era and had, the secular based on basically French Republic, which was not really adapted to the situation of these countries and the culture. Now we have basically three models of societies. We have on the one hand the autocratic system, the Sisi, the Egyptian system like Al-Sisi, and then you have a jihadist model, and then you have a military model which is more in favor today. And what's happening is between these three models there is a competition, and basically the Western states have been mostly kicked out, and it's the Russians who are arriving now. It's mostly Wagner which is present in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, also in Central African Republic. So we see a different thing, the question of at a national level, mediation really being effective. What I would add is we have a complexities of factors here because there is climate change, and climate change is creating or accelerating other traditional conflicts between semi-nomads who are herders versus cultivators, and there are a lot of fighting for small resources. So we have basically hundreds of wars being fought from Senegal to basically to Eritrea on local resources. So what we tried to deal was to create some local agreements between communities to find some peaceful solution, and that it is limited and it doesn't answer the national, it's not a national answer, it's a local answer.
Yeah. Just to say on the Sahel, Sahel's a great lesson for conflicts all over the place, because particularly when it comes to radical Islamist groups. So now you see, as well as the farmer-herder conflict, sort of local resource conflicts, this idea of sort of transnational ideologies. You have different branches of Al-Qaeda with JNIM, you have Islamic State, ISWAP, in Nigeria and in other parts of the Sahel. Nigeria is not the Sahel, but Nigeria and the Sahel. So I think one of the things that for us has been the most interesting is regional envoys, but actually it feels like the key has been working with governments and trying to help these governments approach their local conflicts in different ways. You look at the example of Mali. Mali has taken completely, they decided that they want to securitize their conflict. They said, please go and kill all our jihadists for us. And not only did it not work, but it also created mass atrocities. And the government is in no better place than before. But a lot of these, what we would call local branches of radical groups, actually have agendas that are driven not by transnational ideologies, but by local justice issues. And it is actually, although local agreements do have a role, it's very hard to achieve them if you don't have governments themselves bought into the idea that you need to go out and talk to. If it's just done locally, they can hold for a while, but in Burkina Faso discovered, they can often break down. So trying to help these governments approach their conflicts in a different way is really fundamental. That's going to be a big challenge over the next 10 years.
The problem also, if I may add, is the government's own territory.
And then finally, the question about the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, and particularly, I guess, the things they do while conflicts are still continuing, and whether that is a help or a hindrance or what.
Well, I would start by telling an anecdote. It was 1994, I guess. I was in Geneva. There was the peace process, the peace conference on former Yugoslavia, and on the 8th floor of the Palais des Nations. So there was Milosevic, Tudjman, Izetbegovic, Mladic, and on the basement, it's more people trying to think how to indict the war criminals. And I remember seeing someone coming out of the 8th floor, who was the French ambassador, Bernard Millet, who came to me and said, "It's amazing, I just had a whiskey with Milosevic, and there are some people here who wants to indict work. I don't understand." And so that was basically the mid-90s, and it was really this peace versus justice dilemma which appear, and I think, and so extremely cynical, and I think it's pretty interesting to know it. After the war in former Yugoslavia, I tried to understand who created this, the International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, and it was a French initiative. It was Roland Dumas. And I went to my minister and said, "Well, you created VRCTY, and the following year there was the International Tribunal for Rwanda, and then a few years later there was the International Criminal Court. You create a revolution in international relations, having justice in a time of war. Incredible." And he looked at me if I was crazy. He told me, "I have a problem. I was afraid to be accused to be accomplices of Serbian crimes. And I didn't want me and Mitterrand to be on the dock. So when my justice came, and with his crazy idea, naive, candid idea of having a tribunal, I say, beautiful. I will have a shield, and if it has a preventive effect, so be it." So I was so shocked by his cynical approach. Had to voice, and for each of my ears, and both were synchronic, and so today we are in a situation. On the one hand, we have the International Court of Justice, and it's really interesting because we had a first decision on Russia and Ukraine, and with provisional measures, which is asking Russia to withdraw from Ukrainian territory, but obviously with no effect. And with the ICC, I'm a bit concerned also that it's becoming a weak institution. It's amazing to recall that only 2 years ago, South Africa wanted to withdraw from the ICC. And Omar al-Bashir, the Sudanese president who was indicted for genocide, was on South African territory. And South African authorities didn't want to arrest him. So today they are having the moral high ground, and for very good reasons. What's happening for the Palestinians in Gaza is really awful, so I don't fully understand it. But it's also a cynical game. What is also so answered now, there are two articles in the Rome Statutes, the Article 16 and the Article 53 or 52, I forgot. The Article 16 basically says that if there is a peace process, the Security Council can decide for a single year to all judicial trial. And then there is the other article where, in which the prosecutor can decide to start forever any judicial process if it is in the interest of the victims. Some flexibility in the peace versus justice tension. And I think it's very good. But it would take a lot for the prosecutor to use this article.
Yeah.
And Claire, does the threat of international indictments form any kind of deterrent effect?
The threat of international indictments once a war has started has no deterrent effect. We have also found that cases at the ICC or the ICJ don't actually stop back-channel dialogue before peace processes happen. People still are willing to engage in that dialogue, but when it comes time to actually taking a quiet back-channel, which is the fundamental underpinning, every peace process you have ever seen has started somewhere quietly outside of the public through it comes time to take those public, then it does become, why would we go into a peace process when there are decisions pending against us? Having said that, I do think it is very, very dangerous for us, even though I completely agree these institutions have become quite challenged. Sometimes they're used for sort of political showboating and really help the institutions actually in their credibility long term. Having said that, it's very dangerous for us to say, no, you must wait for peace before you can make any claim on justice. And I'm thinking about the Syria conflict in particular, and this whole question of universal jurisdiction, which has been an extraordinary thing. Countries have been able to bring cases against Bashar al-Assad, and actually, that's the only justice people have got. And we cannot say legitimately, no, you've got to wait until he's around the negotiating table, and then we will decide whether or not that he stands. It's a dangerous thing for us to do. So yes, it's to factor it in to the process of making peace. It's not ours to arbitrate away.
And if I may add, I think it's important during wartime to document war crimes. And when the time is right, then prosecution will happen.
Like the Reckoning Project, which is doing that at the moment in Ukraine.
Time has ticked on. Room for one more round of questions. There's one here. Are there any at the back? Or anyone over this side? I haven't. Let's take one here. Where's the microphone?
Hi, Victor Mallet. Yeah, I can see, there's very strong motivation for peace negotiations between Ukraine, or mediation to bring an end to the war. The same with Gaza and Israel. How do you create that kind of motivation to have peace negotiations in a place like Sudan, which is undergoing this incredibly awful conflict people are writing about or thinking about or talking about, and there are millions and millions of Sudanese who are displaced, who are losing their lives, who are running out of food. I mean, it's really an extraordinary conflict, but you can see that there isn't a great deal of international interest in this particular conflict. I mean, are there mediators right now in?
Yes.
And are they supported by governments?
Let's just take two more questions.
Sorry.
We'll come with Sudan.
Hi. I just wondered, when we talk about the environment in which you have to operate in, and we talk about the ICC. I mean, the ICC has been a lot of pretty discreet, quite a lot of people, quite a lot of countries as a tool of Western power. The ICC in its first decade only indicted African nations. It said it would only take references from the Security Council, which was a green light for America and Britain to, do their jobs in Afghanistan and Iraq without any concern that there would ever be any indictments of anyone there. And they've now, to see the political nature of the ICC, it's suddenly unilaterally indicted a member of the Security Council. We have to, if you want to have an honest discussion about what it's like to mediate, it's a big elephant in the room, and it is Western power, and it is the Americans who are now acting against the will of the world to make sure the UN is absolutely useless stopping anything happening at the genocide in Gaza. I mean, how does it feel to be operating in that kind of environment? Because I think this whole discussion's avoided the big question of, you know, Western hegemony and Pax America. Well, I don't think people in Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, the slaughter, the genocide in Timor, throughout South and Central America, in Africa, Libya, you know, the Congo, we're ignoring what the West gets up to here. So how do you operate in that kind of environment?
One more. I know there's a couple of other hands, but this has got to be the last one. Yeah.
I just wanted to also say thank you for all of your insights this evening, and my question is two-pronged. Firstly, how does religion act as a hurdle, if it does, within mediation processes, and if it does act as a hurdle or something that makes it more difficult, specifically with territorial disputes that have transcendent stakes attached to it, how do you as mediators circumvent sort of the differences between the two parties?
Okay, so do you want to start with Sudan and then the world of Western hegemony? I don't think we've avoided any questions, but I think the questions they've been posed, but it's a fair question. And then the third question there. Claire, do you want to go first?
Sure. Look, I mean, Sudan, I hear you, but I mean, having said that, it does feel like Sudan is just crawling with would-be brokers. I mean, there are some mediators and there are some brokers, and that's a completely different thing. But yeah, Sudan is a conflict that so many people want to solve in a way that's right for them. And that is the problem with Sudan at the moment. It's almost got too many people involved. It's not hitting the international headlines, but it's of critical interest to countries from the UK to the Emiratis to the Saudis who just have work. The Egyptians, I mean, it's like Libya plus. So it's Libya, but more so. But it is true to say, I think another point that you're making, which is a very fair point, is there are a lot of conflicts around the world where many, many people die in very large numbers, where just nobody really cares on. And then it becomes very difficult. One of the things that we find as mediation organizations is you go to a government and you say, hey, can you support us to work in this conflict? And they say, not really that one, but hey, what about Israel-Gaza? When everybody else is obsessed with the conflict du jour. And that is a fundamental problem with the way that we approach peace. It's only the peace that we happen to be interested in today, and then tomorrow we're interested in a different peace, and that's not how peace is made. So that is a big problem. When it comes to the West, I agree. We're shitty, and we have done terrible, terrible things in the West. And we're not the only ones. We're in a world that is things to each other everywhere. Now, it so happens that the West has been the arbitrator of these big international systems, and those systems have been are now falling is maybe an exaggeration, but they're really struggling. And to a certain extent for the West, some of the chickens are coming home to roost. Not probably in the way that you would still a real reality. We have to now look as, I mean, I'm a British citizen, and the UK has got its own conscience issues to grapple with in the way that it's dealt with conflicts around the world. But we have to now look at a world where there are different powers, and those powers are not angels either. And how do we create a space where it's still possible to broker a peace that is fair and does stop death and suffering on large scales in a world where there isn't only one big guy in the room, but quite a few big guys in the room with very sharp elbows and a different view of what a fair peace. When it comes to religion, I just want to say, when it comes to mediation, I think people have fundamental values and interests. Religion is just one of those. It doesn't really matter if you're a Catholic or even a radical Islamist, or, you know, there are issues, are what we would call sort of core values that we feel are red lines that we cannot compromise. And in every conflict, you run up against those. And that is why we have said sort of again and again, you can make and create the climate for peace by bringing communities together and helping them see each other as human. But ultimately, you also need political agreements, deal with the hard issues of borders and boundaries, but also those fundamental values that people can feel are acknowledged and recognized. They can see them in that agreement. And if they can't see them in that agreement, And if what is promised in an agreement is not implemented, then that agreement will fall, and that is the reason why so many agreements fail, because fundamental values. But it's not just a religion.
Follow that, Pierre.
What can I say?
The last word is yours.
No, Sudan, no, I totally agree with you. There are too many players who are trying to mediate and they are neutralizing each other and not helping at all. There is a competition between, it's like almost a market today, and there is unfair competition which is not effective at all. And there are a number of other players, sometimes pretty much the same also, who pretend to mediate, who are delivering weapons to the RSF or the army. Well, that's the first point. The second question, yes, again, the West and other countries have done terrible things. The US, in the 90s, they were supporting the UN. The UN was effective in the 90s because basically it was the vehicle of the US. So it's that's a bit different. And regarding the ICC, well, it was, don't forget that during the 90s and the 2000s, what happened is the Americans launched a very intense campaign to boycott and to kill the ICC. So the ICC was very much a European, possibly an African court at the very beginning, even if it has, a lot of people has lost any trust in it. Regarding religion, religion is part of culture, and both of them are drivers to dehumanize your enemy. So they are being used and abused. The question, but they are sometimes you can use it for the worst, but you can use it for the best. And obviously we have seen in many situations attempts or initiatives in using culture and religion in a good way. And it's interesting that I have a lot of reservation about the Rwandese government, but Gacaca in itself as a tool is an interesting tool. And so, yes, culture and religion could be interesting tools.
Listen, I'm sure there are many other things we could talk about, but we have run out of time. If you want to buy a copy of Pierre's book, you can do that at the back of the room. And if you ask him nicely, I'm sure he'll sign it for you. If you want to find out about any more events at the Conduit Club, there are also people from the Conduit at the back of the room to talk to. But thank you very much for coming, and please show your appreciation for both our panelists.